Heuristic caching. HTTP is designed to cache as much as possible, so even if no cache control is given, responses will get stored and reused if certain conditions are met. This is called heuristic caching. For example, take the following response. This response was last updated 1 year ago. It is heuristically known that content which hasn't been updated for a full year will not be updated for some time after that. Therefore, the client stored this response despite the lack of max age and reuses it for a while. How long to reuse is up to the implementation, but the specification recommends about 10%. In this case, 1/10 of a year of the time after storing. Heuristic caching is a workaround that came before cache control support became widely adopted, and basically all responses should explicitly specify a cache control header. Fresh and stale based on age. Stored HTTP responses have two states: fresh and stale. The fresh state usually indicates that a response is still valid and can be reused, while the stale state means that the cached response has already expired. The criterion for determining when a response is fresh and when it is stale is age. In HTTP, age is the time elapsed since the response was generated. This is similar to the TTL in another caching mechanism. Take the following example response: 60400 seconds. It's 1 week. The cache that stores the example response calculates the time elapsed since the response was generated and uses the result as the response's age. For the example response, the meaning of max age is the following: if the age of the response is less than 1 week, the response is fresh. If the age of the response is more than 1 week, the response is stale. As long as the stored response remains fresh, it will be used to fulfill client requests. When a response is stored in a shared cache, it is possible to tell the client the age of the response, continuing with the example. If the shared cache stores the response for 1 day, the shared cache would send the following response to subsequent client requests. The client which received that response will find it to be fresh for the remaining 400 seconds. The difference between the response's max age and age. Expires or max age. In HTTP 1.0, freshness used to be specified by the expires header. The expires header specifies the lifetime of the cache using an explicit time rather than by specifying an elapsed time. However, the time format is difficult to parse. Many implementation bugs were found, and it is possible to induce problems by intentionally shifting the system clock. Therefore, max age for specifying an elapsed time was adopted for cache control in HTTP 1.1. If both expires and cache control max age are available, max age is defined to be preferred. So it is not necessary to provide expires now that HTTP 1.1 is widely used. Vary. The way that responses are distinguished from one another is essentially based on their URLs, but the contents of responses are not always the same, even if they have the same URL. Especially when content negotiation is performed, the response from the server can depend on the values of the accept language, and accept encoding request header. For example, for English content returned with an accept language EN header and cached, it is undesirable to then reuse that cached response for requests that have an accept language JN request header. In this case, you can cause the responses to be cached separately. based on language by adding accepted language to the value of the vary header. That causes the cache to be keyed based on a composite of the response URL and accept language request header, rather than being based just on the response URL. Also, if you are providing content optimization, for example, for responsive design based on the user agent, you may be tempted to include a user agent in the value of the vary header. However, the user agent request header generally has a very large number of variations, which drastically reduces the chance that the cache will be reused. So, if possible, instead consider a way to vary behavior based on the feature detection rather than based on the user agent request header. For applications that employ cookies to prevent others from reusing cached personalized content, you should specify cache control private instead of specifying a cookie for vary. Validation. Stale responses are not immediately discarded. HTTP has a mechanism to transform a stale response into a fresh one by asking the origin server. This is called validation, or sometimes revalidation. Validation is done by using a conditional request that includes an if modified since or if non-match request header, if modified since. The following response was generated at 22 seconds and has a max age of 1 hour, so note that it is fresh until 23 seconds. At 23 the response becomes stale and the cache cannot be reused. So the request below shows a client sending a request with an if modified since request header to ask the server if there have been any changes made since the specified time. The server will respond with 304 not modified if the content has not changed since the specified time. Since this response only indicates no change, there is no response body. There's just a status code, so the transfer size is extremely small. Upon receiving that response, the client reverts the stored stale response back to being fresh and can reuse it during the remaining 1 hour. The server can obtain the modification time from the operating system file system, which is relatively easy to do for the case of serving static files. However, there are some problems. For example, the time format is complex and difficult to parse, and distributed servers have difficulty synchronizing file update times. To solve such problems, the ETAC response header was standardized as an alternative